Merci, Madame Présidente. Minister, this week we've seen several damning media reports outlining several failures to get a handle on this pandemic over the crucial early stages of the process. Your government continually defers to the experts and defending those early failures, but ultimately the decisions and responsibilities for those decisions always rest with Cabinet. I'm concerned about your government's reliance solely on public health agency and not on the expertise of our military medical intelligence unit, who sounded the alarm way back in January. This unit relies on information not only from the World Health Organization, but also on intelligence shared amongst our Five Eye allies, including the U.S., whose intelligence was warning of this outbreak as far back as November 2019. So my question, Minister, to you is, why did we rely on a body that appears only to be parroting the World Health Organization and information coming from Communist China, and not on our military intelligence unit that was certainly providing a different picture if the Cabinet was willing to listen a few months ago?
Well, thank you for the question. I can assure you that we have and will continue to consider all the sources of information that we have, and that will form our response. In our estimation, we need to continue to consider the science and the medical expertise here, and also look towards the examples of other countries and how they're dealing with this challenge, some of whom are ahead of us in the sense that they've already experienced a worse challenge, and we can get some value in considering what's worked and what's not worked. So we will consider all those sources of information, have done so, and I think it's important to do so.
Well, Minister, again, we had intelligence information back in November and January that highlighted the danger of this and had an urgency underlined in their evaluation of things, where our health officials were saying back in January and February, certainly we shouldn't overreact and we shouldn't worry. So I think the Cabinet has to really look at why some of that intelligence information didn't get to the top and didn't get a fair hearing. Last time you and your colleagues were here, Minister, I cited a 2006 report which was prophetic in its warning about what we're seeing right now as far as lack of preparedness for equipment in this pandemic. The report recommended a federal stockpile, the one I asked Minister Haydu about, and she refused to answer last time you guys were here. She has since acknowledged, Minister, that the stockpile wasn't maintained, and I'm concerned with what your government is doing now to ensure that gross negligence is rectified, not only for the next pandemic, but for the current one. So my question, in addition to the tons of money which understandably we're putting out there for federal assistance to Canadians, have you entered into contractual discussions with manufacturers, not only to fulfill the current backlog need, but looking at setting up stockpiles in the future if there's a second wave or a third wave or another pandemic in the future, so we're better prepared?
Well, I'd like to start by rejecting the premise of your question. We do and will continue to consider all sources of information as we come up with our plans. We will and will need to consider the situation that we're in and the preparedness that we have as we consider next steps. To your specific question about whether we are in the midst of contracting with organizations to provide the appropriate personal protective gear, the answer is yes. To the extent that your question is asking about things like ventilators, the answer is yes. We are in the midst of ensuring that we procure the appropriate resources for our country now, and looking towards having a secure source of supply on an ongoing basis.
My last question, Minister, has to do specifically with finances and directly involves the decisions you've made over the last 4 years. Your government decided to have deficit management funding approach to the last 4 years of our fiscal policy. Do you regret the fact that over the last 4 years you ran up deficits during a relatively decent economic time, and now that we're in the midst of a real huge crisis, do you regret not having that $70 billion available to you in order to substantiate even further the aid you're putting out to Canadians?
First, I think it's important to consider the premise of your question. We found ourselves at the beginning of this challenge in a very strong fiscal position. So what you've seen during the course of the last four and a half years while we've been in office, we've reduced the amount of our debt as a function of our gross domestic product, and we think that that's appropriate. So that puts us in a position where we have the capacity to fund ourselves through this challenge.
Minister.
We will continue to take
Minister.
that approach, of course, when we're not in
Minister.
a crisis period.
I'm sorry, we have to move to another questioner.